Part 1. The Personal Call. We are born into life with healthy original human nature that we soon cast into the great cave of the unconscious to replace with facades that please those around us. Only through our conversations with the unconscious can we rediscover pure nature and free ourselves from these facades. Such conversations come to us through misfortune, forcing our true self to come out of hiding. We communicate with our unconscious through symbols in dreams at night and those of the daydreams we cast into stories. It's the writer's way to the path of a wise hermit holding peace in the holy cave deep at the center of our being. Stories let us reclaim golden thoughts lost under crushing life events. All villains come into a story for one reason: to pull away the hero's facade and free a soul trapped within. Few writers understand that in the process, the villain also pulls away the writer's facade. The personal call to write arises from unfinished business in our personal psychology, enticing us into a story with breadcrumbs leading to lively and often tightly held secrets that we have stored away and forgotten. Sometimes, just by recognizing why a story has come is enough to dispel writer's block. In such moments, a story can suddenly catch fire and seemingly write itself. It isn't. Your unconscious is writing it. The personal call to write naturally varies from person to person and changes as problems come and go across a lifetime. In this chapter, I use my own struggle with writer's block to illustrate how it all works. Chapter 1. Unfinished Business. Altirius non sit quisus esse potest. Paracelsus. Temperatures hovered above the freezing that January evening. Heavy cloud blanketed Portland's dark, saturated streets, eclipsing the full moon. Inside the theater, I stepped into the warm glow of a spotlight trained on center stage. Stage lights in hues of warm reds and easy blues blended into gentle purples, enhancing makeup and costumes, even adding radiance to my on-sale drugstore lipstick, outdated glasses, and the tiny, soon-to-be-gone, discount diamond that I had worn some 18 years. My face blushed as the actors bowed to me. In the upper back row sat my husband and newest girlfriend. The center seats held my emerging future world, my classmates from the university playwriting program, sitting orderly at dead center of the house, surrounded our playwriting professor. New theater friends, skeptical community members, and regular theater patrons filled the outlying seats. But from my perspective, the real show sat at opposing ends of the front row. My father and stepmother, still in office gray, settled modestly at my stage right. Mother, fresh from the beauty shop in a snappy dress and hot pink silk jacket, animated flamboyantly atop her seat at stage left. Sitting buffer between them were a few of my father's office colleagues, the Greek chorus of my life, who had observed my parents rise and fall and witnessed my entire life from their engineering cubicles on the 8th floor of Pacific Power and Light. Their eyes shifted back and forth like slide rules between my parents, as if calculating the sum of my father's long-term choices with a second wife having gained 100 pounds and the first having not. In fact, having gone full-on glamour in the theater world. Father's colleagues nonchalantly craned their necks to see Mother, whose data had been missing in their calculations for years. That my parents were in the same row felt dangerous, like matter and antimatter, with gravitational pull in too close proximity. Even the office chums were impressed. After a quarter-century of abject loathing, my parents had just begun speaking to each other again. Yet through all those years, they parented in an absentia tandem, vigilantly straightening my shoulders, sending me Valentine's cards coming on the same day early every year, and proclaiming their unconditional love for me, along with detailed reminders of my every mistake, then, now, and likely to be. The true joy of my life, daughters 11 and 14, thrilled to be in a big city and in a real theater for the first time in their life, scampered among the mix of family, friends, and strangers. Unbeknownst to them, the one gentleman they chose to tease incessantly was the theater critic for the state's soon-to-be Pulitzer Prize-winning paper. From the stage, I bowed awkwardly into the audience applause, not yet realizing that my entire life, past, disintegrating present, and future, gathered in unison to witness something I was completely unprepared for. Or was I? Some things I knew were coming. I was embarrassed but prepared for the applause, which Mother had explained was the raison de vivre in the theater world, and the magic bonding playwright, cast, and crew into a sort of momentary sacred family. Father, on the other hand, explained that the ratio et ordo of this business was the theater check folded neatly in my pocket to be deposited into an investment account at 10 a.m. sharp on Monday, bar none. It was the only saving grace in his view for my having foolishly given up a solid career as mail clerk at an insurance company to pursue a degree in theater. He rightly foresaw this barely employable child of his heading into years of artistic upheaval, facing unrequited creativity, relentless rejection, economic despair that he would by no means alleviate, and episodes of reckless creativity that would take me away from everyone. But no one prepared me for a public encounter with the ghost of unresolved psychological business in search of resolution. It visited me the previous year to unleash the story's fury, filling the pages of the first act. But as I typed Act 2 on a new sheet, it went on strike and withdrew its creative fuel. While I sat on the stage before a full house, the ghost appeared to explain why. Of course, no one could see it, not even me, but it was absolutely there. This play, by call, was based on a newspaper clipping from 1972 about a 16-year-old girl from a Russian Old Believer community in rural Oregon, ostracized after becoming pregnant by an outsider. Katrina, the main character, struggles to survive in an increasingly technologically based modern-day America. In a desperate, driven moment of fear and hunger, she steps onto a Soviet grain freighter in Portland and asks for asylum. She has no idea that the U.S. and USSR are in the midst of the Cold War, or that it was unheard of for an American to seek Russian shelter. Her simple plan becomes immensely complicated when an army of outraged American diplomats descends on the ship demanding her return. The Russians refuse, and a media spectacle ensues. Because the Old Believers do not register their children's birth, the Americans cannot prove her citizenship. Neither can the Russians prove her asylum status. The battle for possession of a girl without a country ratchets up tensions between the U.S. and USSR that in turn gives rise to a wrenching emotional struggle about what it means to be a Russian or an American. I knew in my bones that this needed to be a full 3-act play, but the story refused further development beyond the first. Fortunately, the act was long enough, intriguing enough, and good enough to be accepted for a reading as a work in progress. As I heard the play unfold that evening, I was surprised to catch glimpses of myself in Katrina, with whom I believed I had nothing in common. Russian Old Believers left Russia some 100 years earlier seeking refuge from persecution by the Tsar. They moved from Siberia to China to South America before settling into the rich North American farmland of Oregon. Yet in each place they held on to old Russia, never losing their language or customs and outright refusing to assimilate into any other place. By contrast, my family came to America from the British Isles long before the Revolutionary War and were part of the establishment of the United States and of American English. Yet beneath the trappings of our outward lives, our stories were symbolically the same, an adolescent torn between a lost folk world and a new one. I was among the first of a Kentucky clan born outside of Appalachia in 200 years. My hillbilly mother married like a war bride to a modern West Coast engineer and set out for the exotic life of a 1950s mainstream, thoroughly modern American housewife. But it all fell to ruin when culture shock shattered her fragile new identity. She had grabbed onto the foreboding reins of promising emergent feminist powers and divorced my father in a dramatic 1960s Wild West style. She soon found herself like a horse and buggy driver at the controls of an aircraft. Bewildered, she regressed to the world she knew best by transforming the interior life of our West Coast home back to patriarchal Kentucky with all its customs. Faith, music, food, and emotional dynamics. All it lacked was a patriarch, which Mother refashioned out of black and white television broadcasts of Reverend Billy Graham. Like something out of a Twilight Zone episode, she and my grandmother pressed another layer of fingerprints onto the TV screen as if waiting to be sucked into the crusade for Christ, where Brother Billy reached to touch them personally with the laying on of hands from 2,000 miles away. In Kentucky style, I was also discouraged from making friends of non-relatives, just as my character Katrina was forbidden from mingling with outsiders. She was exiled at 16, the same age I was when, amid economic collapse, my grandmother took command of family life and led me into marriage with a man in his 20s who scandalously was not a relative. Katrina could not read or write English. Neither could I decipher the marriage license my grandmother compelled my mother to sign on my behalf. I had not yet untangled the severe dyslexia locking me out of the printed world. That was compounded by my severe visual perceptual disability, rendering the world around me like a Jackson Pollock painting. From my view, Pollock was a realist. Katrina and I both struggled to understand the greater world and where we belonged in it. In such situations, stories bring comfort and direction toward a new reality. For writers, it is our own mapping. Fiction comes from the same part of the mind as dreams, where unfinished business, disguised in visual symbols, break through the surface of our consciousness. What is too painful to face in the naked light of everyday life is navigated through metaphor in stories, allowing us to approach, rethink, revise, and relive experience in quest of resolution and merciful release. In Baikal, events happen for Katrina that I unconsciously wanted for myself. Powerful people with diplomatic authority sweep onto the scene and fight for me with promises to take me where I belong, to be valued and protected. The promises, however, are but the facade of political gamesmanship. She is a pawn in a proxy war. With each line the actors read, I saw myself ever more clearly. Baikal symbolized my own forfeited childhood. Amid the ravages of a different proxy war long ago, my own combatants now sat in the theater at opposing ends of the front row, opposing me. Somehow, through the alchemical fire of writing, I was rekindling that war, changing the ending, and finding meaning in scars still confining the reach of my thoughts. Human emotion is a complicated form of existence few in the West truly understand. Our training is typically limited to controlling our feelings, which does not mean actual control, rather just outright strong-arm suppression, where binary societies school men to hide any show of tears and women to vanquish rage. Even in a gender pluralistic society, we are forbidden to admit shame and jealousy. This grotesquely hinders our development of an abundant, native gift of emotional intelligence, one we can train to highly sophisticated levels alongside logic. We have a multitude of feelings coursing through us at any given moment, yet few of us can identify them. The American poet Robert Bly observed that in our era we are, quote, unable to distinguish or even find the words to discriminate between despair and depression, irritation and anger, sympathy and empathy, end quote. Emotions do not come one at a time, isolated from one another. They rush in, combining, aligning, integrating, even managing for opposing emotion to collaborate in creating high levels of richly complex feeling. Unfortunately, in our era, we have no idea what to do with them because we privilege logic to the point of completely ignoring emotion as an equally powerful and legitimate form of intelligence. We label our unruly feelings as complexes to be dumped on a psychologist's couch. Yet human emotion is far too complex and varied a gift for those trained in heavy logic to sort through. The narrow confines of logic-driven science cannot comprehend, let alone investigate, the feeling-driven world we experience in meditation, dream, and writing. It wasn't until sitting on that stage during the post-performance discussion that I understood why I picked this particular story. The audience was speculating how to develop the play into 3 acts when someone pointed out, obviously the shame needs better development. Shame? I thought to myself. What shame? Oh, yes, I replied, my shame for not finishing the play. To my surprise, they laughed. I laughed to cover up that I wasn't laughing. The theater critic said that Katrina exploits her victimization to get revenge on her family is the crux. What? I thought, was he crazy? How could he be a critic at his level and not understand this very simple story? Then others in the audience voiced agreement with him. I was dumbfounded. My playwriting teacher would later observe that a long, awkward silence followed. I didn't notice the pause because in that moment I was overtaken by a flash of insight, revealing the completed 3-act play to me quite suddenly and all at once. All it needed to unfold itself was for Katrina to recognize her newfound power. In stories, as in real life, a metaphysical calculus ciphers oppression into some measure of power given time. The consequences of that power, be it grand or subtle, unfold for good or evil depending on what you do with the sum of it. Calamity, then, presents us with a choice. We can evolve into emotional maturity in the service of the greater world, or retreat behind a too small mask of immaturity constructed of self-focused victimhood. Choosing victimhood long past its shelf life leaves us stale and passed by in the ticking of time. Being ignored gives way to frustration, driving many of us to seek vengeance, be it passive aggression with guilt as our weapon, or outward acts of self-righteous tyranny. I chose the path of passive aggression, which I projected onto Katrina, but I could not see it in her. I gave her no direction for it. That left her running in circles until the story exhausted its remaining energy and collapsed. The fix was incredibly easy. She only needed to recognize she had real power for the first time in her life and then react to it, for good or evil. Evil in the form of covert vengeance would ignite the play from beginning to end, like Louisiana Christmas Eve bonfires racing along the Mississippi River. I looked at my parents, the theater critic, and the wider audience. I saw what I could not see before: my power. We all face these moments, and we share the same experience of the first moment we discovered it. As tiny infants, our cries brought others rushing to our aid, driven by their instinct to do everything possible for the baby's survival. But then came that first moment when we recognized an ability to command others to come when there was no need. Very soon thereafter, and to our great dismay, those who once came rushing to our aid now only laugh at the milestone. In the very same moment that we discover and claim power, we also begin losing it. This is the birth of our shadow, and it will echo through our entire life each time we realize there is power in our own victimhood, be it petty or great, and willfully use it beyond the appropriate moment. We in the Western world see the shadow as a negative or somewhat evil part of our psyche, but there is a positive side to it. Through the acts of the shadow, we see our mistakes, correct them, and evolve through them. The evil aspect of the shadow arises when we fail to see the errors of our ways, fail to grow through them, and atrophy. In Volume 3 of this series, The Core Narrative Theories, and Volume 4, The Psychology, Philosophy, and Mythology of Storytelling, we explore in detail how the shadow acts as catalyst for the soul's enlightenment. For now, suffice it to say that there are times when the shadow appears as the archetypal wise hermit holding the lantern of transformation for momentarily disoriented souls. Stories germinate in the deeply private, carefully protected shell of a writer's psyche. But there must come a moment when the story breaks free from the writer's suffocating maternal grip to become an entity of its own. For this, we need to clearly recognize two things. Firstly, the unacceptable shadow of the character we most love. And secondly, pieces of ourself in the one we most hate. The courage of a writer is tested here, as is our willingness to let the story grow into an autonomous being. To set Baikal free, I had to let Katrina move beyond the tragic loss of her innocence, taken by neglect and abandonment. She needed to feel her awakening anger stirring the ego dragon of revenge. She had to recognize that she had power, real power, power enough to catch the attention of world leaders. She then had to find means to transcend her anger in order to mature beyond victimization. The moral of such a story comes from the ancient lesson that our life course is determined not by what is done to us, but rather by what we do with what is done to us. Katrina had many choices, but she chose the most explosive one, the one raining maximum pain onto her family, as well as the two societies that failed her. The movement of this story, as in every story, is driven by the fall of an ego and the consequences such a fall unleashes. I looked at my parents. Did they know that this play was a covert act of rage against them? Katrina was my doppelganger, going public with my vengeance. The stories we create beckon us to untangle impossibly dense personal struggles. Without it, there would be no stories. But writing grants more than psychological healing. It is also our path to enlightenment. Through writing, we let go of the ego's fig leaf concealing our vulnerability. Just beyond that thin veil is the noble beauty of who we really are. I wrote Baikal to send a message to myself that took years to reach me. I was once an innocent victim, but had carried that mantle long past its shelf life. It was time to mature, release the terrible weight of memory, and move beyond the anger by transforming it into a beautiful story for the greater world. In doing so, I found and restored pieces of my original nature, lost for a time as I encountered life's natural cruelties. Traveling from birth into childhood and arriving as an adult, I misplaced eager hopes and visions by choosing the path of least resistance rather than struggling against the brutal forces of scorn and ridicule. I let the world around me reshape my self-worth to fit its desires, which then dissolved my dreams. But to my utter surprise, the terrible struggle of self-discovery through writing led me to rediscover one of the greatest triumphs of my life, the restoration of my dreams through the creation of a play, one worthy of leaving me to enter the world. Stories come from the same place as dreams, and like dreams, the first spark is very personal. This provides a mechanism for the writer to recognize and ultimately release their personal villains. Doing so lets the story transform from the second dimension into the third, one governed by the social call to write. Certainly, it's difficult to let your story grow into maturity and leave you for the world, but failing to do so condemns it. The writer's ego provides a safe shell for vulnerable story ideas to gestate, but for the story to discover its autonomous self, it must free itself from its creator. This is why Oedipus the king does not come across as a personal tirade of Sophocles, nor Hamlet as a pouting, personal rant of Shakespeare. Whether they were aware of it or not, these great writers successfully addressed the personal call once they released their characters from an ego-centered daydream to become their own entities born into the greater consciousness of society.